Hello, 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 Year 9 historians. My favourite kind of historian. Let's talk about peace and commemoration of World War One. Australia is the country that spends the most amount of money on commemoration of World War One out of any country in the world, I believe. We recently spent, I think about $250 million making a museum about World War One in France. Yeah. So anyway, good use of money, I'll let you decide. Learning goals today. You're going to know some consequences of World War One. World War One happened. And then what? You're going to know what happened to returning soldiers. You're going to know about the Anzac legend. And you're going to be able to think using different historical perspectives. We did an activity on this quite recently. It's a really important historical thinking skill, being able to get into the head of someone from history to understand their perspective. Right. A changed world. World War One was this huge. It involved the whole world, but essentially it was a big European civil war. It just so happened that the European countries had so many other countries in their empires that it ended up involving lots of different other parts of the world. But there wouldn't have been a world war if it wasn't for Europe. Okay, it was a big European civil war. And this is not one of the notes, but this is probably the biggest takeaway out of World War One. World War One, before World War One, Europe was undoubtedly the most powerful place in the world. All the rich, powerful, industrialized countries, all in Europe. World War One, they had this massive civil war, destroyed their economies, killed millions and millions, 17 million people. There was a global flu pandemic afterwards that killed about 50 million people, completely destroyed their economies, put them backwards. Never again. Well, maybe. Anyway, that was the end of Europe being the most powerful place in the world. After World War One, the USA became the new dominant power in the world. Okay, so probably the biggest number one thing to take out of World War One was that Europe was top dog before it, then it punched itself in the face, and then the US became top dog. Now, in our lifetime, we are probably witnessing the US not becoming top dog anymore, which is what we call living in interesting times. Anyway, enough of me rambling. A changed world. 17 million dead, many more wounded. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Turkish, and Russian empires all ended. Yeah, 4 massive world empires came to an end after the end of that war. It's a big deal. Now, obviously, 3 of those were empires on the losing side of the war, but also the Russian Empire ended. Well, you could technically say that Russia lost as well, because they did kind of surrender to the Germans. You know, people were very unhappy with their governments all around the world, because their governments led them into this massive slaughter. Good one, governments. Okay. So there you go. This is a little infographic which contradicts what I just told you. Anyway, 37 million casualties. So that's dead and wounded. 16 million. Yeah, that's too small to read. Anyway, this is like the deadliest war that had ever happened up until that point. Until you find out about World War II. Oh boy. Now, there is something I'll say here. And this is not mentioned in this lesson, but it's probably relevant to people watching this from 2020 onwards. At the end of World War One, there was a global flu pandemic called the Spanish flu, and that killed more people than World War One. It killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. Anyway, not cool. So, how deadly was World War One? This shows you a percentage of the soldiers that were sent into battle. What percentage of them were casualties? And a casualty means either dead or wounded. Okay. Austria-Hungary, 90% of the soldiers they sent into battle died or were wounded. 2/3 of the soldiers that Germany sent in died or were wounded. In France, 73%, about 3/4 of the soldiers sent into World War One died or were wounded. Yeah, so there's some huge numbers there. Here's another way to show you a similar statistic. This is a percentage of people who died compared to your whole population. This is not compared to the number of soldiers that you sent in. This is compared to your total population, right? So have a look at Turkey, or what was the Ottoman Empire then. 13 to 15% of its entire population died. Yeah. In Germany, about 4% of its population died, and so on. The darker red it is, the higher percentage of the total population died. That's military and civilians together. Freaky stuff. Right, let's talk about repatriation. Repatriation means to come back to your country. 260,000 Australian soldiers were repatriated to Australia in 1918. At the end of the war, almost 250,000 soldiers came back to Australia. Big influx of people. And obviously the war deeply affected them. Yeah, they had mental health was not really a common topic back then as it is now, and so a lot of people who came back who were like severely mentally disturbed from having been involved in this really deadly war and seeing dead bodies, seeing their friends die in front of their face, you know, explosions everywhere, hearing artillery shells 24 hours a day for weeks on end, wasn't spoken about that openly. And a lot of World War One soldiers, as it is a little bit today, there's a little bit of a taboo, a little bit of a stigma around mental health. There's still like, oh, you got mental health, there's something deficient. You know, if you break your leg, then you just go and get it fixed, sweet as. If you're depressed, then, or you suffer from anxiety, then there's more of a stigma against you. You don't just go, oh, can I get a pill for that? Or, oh, is there some activities I can do that will help me with my depression or my anxiety? Yeah, mental health has a stigma now, and back then it had way more of a stigma. So there'll be people coming back from World War One suffering from what is now called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah, the stress disorder that you suffer after you've witnessed trauma, i.e., been in World War One. Back then it wasn't called PTSD, it was called shell shock. The idea that you got shocked from so many artillery shells blowing up around you. Yeah, heaps of World War One soldiers came back and were never really the same again. Not only were heaps of them physically wounded, many of them were mentally wounded. So what did some of them get when they came back? Some of them got free training, and some of them got free land to go and become farmers. So the government was like, yeah, you did us a solid, we'll give you some free training so that you can train up so that you can get a job, and we'll give you some land so that you can farm it and earn an income that way. This is a boatload of Australian soldiers coming back at the end of World War One. I'm sorry, it's the most rubbish quality photo ever, but just imagine it amazing. Yeah, they're all sitting on this boat. I don't know if, yeah, so all these boats were piled up. 260,000 soldiers came back to Australia at the end of World War One. That is a heap. Right, so they could go to the rehabilitation centre. And this is the kinds of things that they could get. You could get advice about getting a job, maybe get reinstated to your old job, maybe start your apprenticeship up again. They'd give you help finding a job. They'd give you help coming up with a job of your own choice. Maybe they'd give you a loan for you to start a business. They might be able to provide you with housing. They would give you full-time training, part-time training. They'd teach you to be a farmer. They might give you land, that's land settlement. Or they might give you loans. They might give you loans to start a business. They might give you loan to buy tools of trade if you're going to be an apprentice, so maybe you need to go out and buy some carpentry stuff. They might give you loans to buy a house or to buy some farmland, and they would also give you free legal aid. So there you go. All kinds of rehabilitation offered for soldiers that came back from World War One. Here is a bulletin published by the Department of Repatriation. It's called Repatriation. It's a very amazing title. And then help the man with the medal. So the idea being, you know, help the soldier that came back with a medal. And it's just a magazine, a bulletin published monthly telling returned soldiers, returned servicemen, the kinds of support that they could get when they came back to Australia. It's too small for me to read, but I don't know what we've got there. Employment, training, yeah. Right, let's talk about Anzac Day. Remember Anzac Day, Australia, New Zealand Army Corps. That was the group of soldiers that were put together to originally fight in Gallipoli. That failed campaign where we tried to conquer Turkey but lost. Anyway, many saw World War I as a chance to prove themselves heroes and part of Britain's great military. Yeah, Britain had the biggest empire in the world up till that point, and Australia wanted to prove itself as like a real country to be welcomed into this hall of real countries. Anyway, so that's what they saw World War I as. A lot of Australian ideals were seen or forged in Gallipoli. This idea of mateship. Mateship is just an Australian word for friendship, as far as I can tell. And bravery at Gallipoli. So Anzac Day has been celebrated since 1916, yeah, straight after the campaign ended. On the 25th of April, we get a public holiday. Go team! Many thought Gallipoli was when Australia became a nation. I know that sounds a bit wacky to say. Didn't we become a nation when we voted ourselves as a nation and became a nation on the 1st of January 1901, Australian Federation? No, we became a nation in the battlefield at Gallipoli, even though we lost. Anyway, as you can tell, I'm sort of throwing in a bit of my own opinion here. I'm not a massive fan of this Anzac legend, and I'll explain a bit more why in a sec. For many people, it's Australia's unofficial national day, yeah, especially now that Australia Day, 26th of January, is quite controversial because it's the day that the first fleet arrived, and Indigenous Australians are like, why are we celebrating the day when European settlers came here and stole our land and killed us with smallpox? Anzac Day, the 25th of April, can be seen as another national day for Australia. Anzac Day. Right, so obviously the 2020 service was done all done online. Lest we forget. What does that mean? I'll see if Google knows. Hey Google, what does lest we forget mean?
On the website Quora.com, they say, more commonly is lest we forget, which means something like we should remember. Lest means something like in case.
Awesome. There you go. So lest kind of means in case. So let's, commemorate Anzac Day in case we forget the sacrifice that the soldiers in World War I made. It's this huge rite of passage for Australians is to attend the dawn service in Gallipoli. So this is in Turkey, yeah? So they set up all these huge grandstands and heaps of Aussies and Kiwis and probably some Turks as well, all rock up at dawn on the 25th of April, which is the exact time that the Anzacs landed at Anzac Cove. They've even renamed the cove. The cove that they landed in had a Turkish name, but it's now called Anzac Cove. I don't know if that's what the Turks call it, but that's what we call it. Anyway, so this is dawn service in Gallipoli in Turkey. Okay, last slide of notes, I promise. So the Anzac legend, yeah, we're talking about the legend, the meaning, the legacy of the Anzacs and all that stuff. So Anzac Day is seen differently. Not everybody agrees that Anzac Day and the military tradition should be celebrated in the way that it is. And here's why. It makes war seem glorious, and that this is a bad thing, right? War's not glorious. You ask the soldiers that came back, war poetry became quite a big thing in World War I, and you've got lots of poets who wrote about the heroism of soldiers in the war, but then you've got another bunch of poets who wrote about how it wasn't heroic, it was just horrible. Some people think, Anzac Day, we're celebrating World War I. We only got involved in World War I because we were blindly following Britain. There was a European civil war happening tens of thousands of kilometres away. Why did we even get involved? Some people think. But then other people say, but hang on, the Anzac soldiers themselves are heroes, and we should continue to honour them by remembering what they did. So there's a couple of different sides. Because there is debate in the community, there are books written by historians arguing for and against the Anzac legend. This is a screenshot from the Australian newspaper, a conservative newspaper, which is arguing that this book written by a historian who's against Anzac wasn't good. Yeah. Left-wing historians persistently maintain the Great War was a series of mistakes and was ultimately meaningless. That's what one of these historians thinks. And there's another book by Marianne Lake, a very, very famous Australian historian. What's Wrong with Anzac? The idea, what they're suggesting is that the militarisation of Australian history. Yeah, it focuses too much on military in Australian history, and they're saying that that might be a bad thing. Okay, your activity today is to take on a historical perspective. Give 2 arguments in favour of and 2 arguments against the idea that Anzac Day should be Australia's official national day. Yeah, they can just be dot points, that's fine. So just say Anzac Day should be Australia's official national day. For dot point, against dot point. Booyah. Okay, our first video today. Yeah, it's behind the news. Not beyond the news, but behind the news. Anzac Day. Take it away.
G'day, my name's Ruby and let's have a look at what's making news today. Today is Anzac Day, which is all about commemorating the people who have served and died in the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. Let's find out a bit more about it.
Around the country today, Aussies attended services to commemorate Anzac Day. Anzac is an acronym for Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and it's held today because on April the 25th, 1915, Australian and New Zealand forces began their first major military battle. Anzacs, along with soldiers from other countries, landed in Gallipoli in Turkey during World War I. The soldiers were expecting a flat beach and small hills, but they were taken to the wrong one and had to climb cliffs. That made it easy for the enemy Turkish soldiers waiting on the hills above to shoot at them. There was 8 months of fighting before the Anzacs and Allies got away, but more than 130,000 soldiers from both sides were killed in Gallipoli, including more than 11,000 Anzacs. The war continued for another 3 years, and of course there were many more battles until it finally ended in 1918. Now the 25th of April is a public holiday in Australia. People around the country attend services, and lots of Aussies even travel to Gallipoli to pay their respects and remember Gallipoli as the first battle we took part in as a nation.
A while ago, the country India banned the app TikTok, but now it's back. TikTok was banned there because of worries that it wasn't doing enough to protect young people. The company behind TikTok appealed that decision and argued that social media platforms shouldn't be held responsible for the stuff that users post, and that only a really small percentage of people on the app use it inappropriately. Now the ban has been dropped, and given that almost a quarter of the world's TikTok users are in India, I'm sure there are lots of people who are very happy about that. Lego has announced that it's bringing out a new range of blocks with Braille on them. Someone pitched this idea to Lego a few years ago, and since then they've been perfecting the idea into this. The blocks are designed to help kids have fun while they learn how to read Braille, which is a written language for blind people that uses a series of raised dots. The set's going to be released next year, and Lego is giving them away for free to organisations that help people who are blind or vision impaired. A trip up to the International Space Station is not your average work trip. It takes a lot of training, and you're about to meet an astronaut that's doing that right now.
Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano is learning how to repair a special part of the ISS. And where else would you practice a spacewalk than at the bottom of a massive swimming pool? This neutral buoyancy lab is at NASA's Johnson Space Center. They're underwater because it's the easiest way to experience zero gravity without leaving Earth. But it can take some getting used to.
You have to come up with very ingenious ideas of how to handle things, how to position yourself. You have to learn how to use new tools that have never been used before.
It's not actually that weird for Luca though. He's already spent about 166 days in space on a previous mission to the ISS. But they always need a refresher. Luca's mission blasts off in July, but until then, he'll be right here, doing even more training.
This next segment is about some very lucky animals being given the royal treatment. All hail King Beau, the most beautiful bulldog in all the land, according to the judges at this bulldog beauty contest. Beau's crown wasn't won easily. He had some tough competition from this Easter bunny stunner, a cook with a professional look, and this hoon of a hound. This wombat in Tassie had an itch to scratch and decided the back wheel of a bicycle was the perfect place to do just that. The cyclist was even polite enough to hold the bike steady. And this distressed mama duck was given the royal treatment by local firefighters over in the US when her babies got stuck in a storm drain. They used nets to fish the tiny chicks out, and when all 9 of them were reunited, off they waddled again. And that's the show for today, guys. But tell me, did you go to a dawn service this morning? What was it like? Did you have a grandparent or maybe a great-grandparent who was an Anzac? Let us know in the comments, and as always, don't forget to subscribe to our channel.
So, like any big historical event, there are some myths about Anzacs, and they are put to the test in this video from the ABC. Check it out.
The story of Anzac and Gallipoli is still an important part of Australia's national folklore. We all grew up with the tales of Jacker VC, Simpson and his donkey, stories of bravery under fire and mateship on the battlefield. But how much of that is fact and how much is fiction? Let's find some experts to tell us. Let's start with an easy one that everybody knows about Anzac. We landed at the wrong place, didn't we?
It's a common misconception. In fact, the Anzacs landed pretty well right in the centre of the originally selected landing zone.
For decades, people have tried to explain the failure of Gallipoli by blaming it on the Royal Navy. But the Royal Navy did land the troops in approximately the right spot. It was what happened after the landing where things went wrong.
You say approximately the right spot. Wasn't it at the bottom of a cliff or something?
It was always going to be at the bottom of a cliff, but the Navy's navigational methods in those days meant that they couldn't get any closer than the kilometre stretch of beach that they did land the troops on.
We're told that the Australian soldiers at Gallipoli were natural fighting men, bushmen who were crack shots and great horsemen. But just how good were they really?
Well, the reality was that they were not really a race of athletes, as they were sometimes called. The argument goes that even though they lived in the major towns, they knew what it was like to live in the bush because they went camping and they'd absorbed the values of the bush.
The Australian troops were the best physical specimens that could be found, but they were mostly found in Australia's cities.
A fine contingent of men, no doubt about that at all. And they did stand out alongside the British troops in Egypt. People noticed the difference in their bearing, their size and so on. But they were not good soldiers. At the outset, when they landed, they were actually very inexperienced amateurs. They had to learn in a very hard school.
John Simpson Kirkpatrick and his donkey, whose name was Abdul, by the way. Although it turns out one of the greatest legends to Anzac may have a little bit more to it.
There might have been several donkeys, and the Simpson story is a very confused one. So it's probable that Simpson did use several donkeys.
He was British, not Australian, and certainly he brought men down from the heights who had been wounded, and he was killed quite early in the Gallipoli campaign. What about the claim that Simpson saved dozens of lives, bringing them all down on the donkey's back?
Probably untrue. He did very brave work. He went into the gullies, he rescued men who were wounded, but mostly men with leg wounds. He may not have actually saved a single soldier who was going to die, but he brought wounded men down, he did it under fire, and it was very brave. But the legend grew way after that, and as one historian has written about him, he was far busier in death than he was in life.
Tell us about the famous drip gun and some of the myths that have grown up around that little innovation.
Yes, that was quite a clever improvisation. The idea was it would keep firing when the trenches had been evacuated, so water dripped from one container into another and tripped the trigger of the rifle. But I doubt that it really deceived the Turks. There's quite a bit of evidence from the Turkish side now that the much vaunted secret evacuation had not really deceived the Turks.
The drip gun contributed nothing to the evacuation because by the time the first drip gun went off, all of the troops were evacuated.
Where did these myths come from, though?
The myths of Gallipoli started on the day of the landing, and the war correspondence reports, the military reports, the histories. We've all got a huge emotional investment in Gallipoli, and Australians want it to be an important story and a positive story. History isn't always that neat, though.
To some extent, it doesn't really matter whether memories are absolutely accurate. They serve a function in people's lives.
I think the creators of the legend were the men themselves.
A lot of the myths that evolved around Anzac and Gallipoli did so for a very good reason, a national coping mechanism for what was undoubtedly a tragedy. And in a way, a lot of those myths have become a part of our history as well. For ABC Fact Check, I'm John Barron.
Your reflection activity today, a sense poem. So, with the topic being World War One, you got to complete each of these sentences. I see, I hear, I smell, I feel, and I taste. So, 5 short line poem with those as the stems about World War One. Do it. Oh, red! It's homework time. Sweet. Okay. I want you to answer these questions in your exercise book, including the question and the answer. I know you know what that means. 1. What were some of the outcomes of World War One? 2. What did returning soldiers get? And 3. Why do some people think that we shouldn't celebrate Anzac Day? Why indeed? Okay, some of you are keen as beans, and that's great. Your bonus homework is to read chapter 8.13 from the History Alive 9 textbook. Also, watch this. This is some historians debating. It's quite interesting. That's not very long. Debating Anzac Day and its meaning and how much we should celebrate it. Check it out. bit.ly/Anzac debate. Thank you so much for taking part in the lesson. I do appreciate it. And as always, keep it real.